How did one protein bar convince America's most trusted doctors, neuroscientists, and fitness icons to stake their reputations on 150 calories that weren't actually 150 calories? Because David didn't just sell a protein bar. They sold a promise backed by science, then allegedly used that science selectively to make the math work on the label. Here is the scope. $1 million in sales in the first week, $75 million raised in 8 months. A $725 million valuation before their first birthday. Over 3,000 retail locations. Andrew Huberman, Peter Attia, Arnold Schwarzenegger, all attached, then a lab test, then a 46-page lawsuit, then the Epstein files, then their own chief science officer, the man who made the science credible, was gone in a weekend. This is the story of how David built the most hyped protein bar in America, allegedly falsified the most important number on the label, and lost it all before the ink was dry. Picture every protein bar you've ever picked up. Colorful packaging, bold claims, a nutrition label you had to squint at and feel vaguely lied to by. By 2024, this was a $7 billion category growing at 6.3% annually, and every brand faced the same physics problem. More protein meant more ingredients, more processing, and almost always more calories. Quest bars had 21 grams of protein and 190 calories. Kind Protein had 12 grams and 200 calories. Nobody had cracked 28 grams of protein under 200 calories. Nobody. But that wasn't even the real challenge. The structural problem ran deeper. There was one ingredient that could theoretically solve it. EPG, esterified propoxylated glycerol, is a modified fat that mimics the texture of conventional fat but metabolizes at just 0.7 calories per gram instead of 9 calories per gram. Other food brands had already built businesses around it. Own Your Hunger, Lighten Up Foods, and Defiant Foods all relied on EPG. The catch was that exactly one company on Earth manufactured it, a food tech startup called Epig. Nobody owned the supply chain, nobody controlled the science. And then came the ultimatum. A bar making claims that sounded impossible, 28 grams of protein, 150 calories, 0 sugar, would only sell if people believed it. That required scientific credibility that marketing alone couldn't manufacture. Peter Rahal, co-founder and CEO of Linus Technologies operating as David Protein, said publicly he wanted to build something anti-fragile, a brand that wouldn't collapse under trend shifts the way his previous company RX Bar had struggled during the keto era. At this point, most founders would have partnered carefully, labeled conservatively, and grown slowly. Instead, David bet everything on owning the science, owning the supply chain, and owning the most impressive label number in the category. The plan had 4 moves. Launch direct to consumer on September 16, 2024, with the boldest protein to calorie claim on the market. Recruit Dr. Peter Attia, Stanford-trained physician, author of Outlive, and one of the most credible voices in longevity medicine, as chief science officer and investor. Bring in neuroscientist and Stanford professor Dr. Andrew Huberman as an investor and public endorser. Then, in May 2025, deploy the $75 million Series A led by Green Oaks Capital to acquire Epog itself, locking every competitor out of the sole EPG supply chain forever. The official positioning was the most effective portable protein on Earth, superior protein for the human form. Here's what made EPG the perfect ingredient and the perfect liability. The calorie count on David's label, 150 calories, was calculated using EPG's proprietary metabolic methodology, which accounts for how the human body actually absorbs the ingredient. The Food and Drug Administration's standard calculation method, the Atwater factors, treats fat as fat. When independent labs later used Atwater factors and the AOAC 945.44 method on David bars, the number they got was not 150. While David was acquiring Epig and locking out rivals, RXBAR, Rahal's own former company, launched a 6-ingredient, 18-gram protein bar in May 2025 exclusively at Target, competing directly on clean label credibility. RxBAR's brand DNA, built by Rahal himself, printed every ingredient on the front of the package. 3 egg whites, 6 almonds. No BS. David's front label said one thing, 150 calories. The irony could not be sharper. But the real disaster was not the strategy. It was the execution. September 16, 2024, DavidProtein.com went live. Gold packaging, serif font, a minimalist aesthetic borrowed from luxury fashion rather than fitness. Michelangelo's David served as brand inspiration, what Rahal called the rigor and intelligence it takes to create a timeless product. Flavors included blueberry pie, fudge brownie, cake batter, and red velvet. The pitch was the highest protein to calorie ratio of any bar on the market. Week 1, $1 million in sales. The internet noticed immediately. January 23, 2026, lead plaintiff Daniela Lopez filed a class action complaint, case number 1:26CV00635, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York against Linus Technologies Incorporated. That same month, David's Subway ad campaign debuted across New York City MTA cars and stations, a gold-wrapped bar floating in pure white space, no text, no claims. A branding triumph ran simultaneously with a federal lawsuit. TikTok erupted. The hashtag DavidProtein spawned thousands of videos invoking the scene from the film Mean Girls, where Regina George is tricked into eating high-calorie bars disguised as diet food. The phrase "you just got Regina George'd" ricocheted across the platform in days. David's Instagram response, "No one is getting Regina George'd," inadvertently kept the meme alive for another news cycle. As Seth Godin observed in This Is Marketing, trust is the only currency that cannot be manufactured. Here is what David missed. In a category where consumers track macros down to the gram, the nutrition label is not marketing material, it is a contract. When FDA-accredited laboratory testing, commissioned by the Lopez plaintiffs, found 263 to 275 calories in bars labeled 150, they did not just challenge a number. They challenged the entire premise of the brand. The more aggressively you market precision, the more catastrophically a precision failure lands. RxBar built its entire brand on the opposite principle: print every ingredient on the front and shame competitors into honesty. Rahal invented that playbook, then he apparently abandoned it. Here is what the Consumer Lab report found before the lawsuit was even filed. In August 2025, the independent supplement testing organization flagged David bars for a major label discrepancy. It found 2 grams of fat declared, 9.7 grams detected. The gap stemmed from EPG registering as conventional fat in standard testing. Then came the January 2026 lawsuit results. They found 263 to 275 calories per bar versus 150 advertised, up to 83% more. Fat content was between 11 and 13.5 grams versus 2 grams on the label, up to 400% more. In his Vanity Fair interview, Rahal stated that the claim fails to understand how the FDA measures calories for EPG, explaining that burning EPG in a bomb calorimeter treats it as fully digestible even though the human body does not absorb it that way. The defense has scientific logic. It has a legal problem. The FDA regulations require that nutrient content not exceed the declared value by more than 20%. The alleged gap is from 78% to 83%. The plaintiff's laboratory used FDA-approved methodology, but the numbers were just the beginning. June 2025. 3 months before the calorie lawsuit, Own Your Hunger, LC, Lighten Up Foods, and Defiant Foods filed an antitrust complaint in the Southern District of New York against Linus Technology, Epogee LLC, and Peter Rahal personally. The Sherman Act claims described an orchestrated acquisition designed to cut off competitors from a supply chain they had built businesses around. According to the complaint, Epogee notified clients on May 29, 2025 via email that new orders were no longer being accepted. At least 5 food manufacturers had already begun layoffs or discontinued products entirely. Then, on January 31, 2026, the Department of Justice released 3 million Epstein files. Dr. Peter Adia's name appeared 1,700 times. On Tuesday of that same week, CBS News had announced Atia as a new contributor. By Friday, the files were public. On Monday, February 3rd, Rahal posted on X that Dr. Peter Atia had stepped down from his role as Chief Science Officer at David and that the company remained focused on serving its customers. Within 48 hours, Atia's name and photograph were removed from David's website and experts page. AG1 simultaneously confirmed Atia no longer served as an advisor. Mark Ritson of Marketing Week has argued that borrowed credibility depreciates faster than it appreciates. Here is what David's investor structure created: a company whose scientific legitimacy lived inside two human beings, Atia and Huberman, rather than in independently verifiable product data. When Atia became a liability overnight, David did not just lose a chief science officer, they lost the peer-reviewed halo that made 150 calories credible to a scientifically literate audience already questioning the math. AG1 had built institutional credibility through third-party testing partnerships long before any controversy arrived. David had not. March 2026. Lopez versus Linus Technologies sits in early litigation. No trial date, no settlement, no FDA enforcement action. David continues selling bars across 3,000 plus retail locations, projecting $180 million in second-year revenue. The $725 million valuation has never been stress tested by a public market. It is increasingly being stress tested by federal courts. Two companies figured out what David apparently did not. Quest Nutrition built a high-protein bar empire through transparency and ingredient lists, aggressive third-party testing, and community trust earned one CrossFit gym at a time, and no proprietary fat replacement was required. RX Bar built $600 million in value by making the label itself the marketing. Every number on RX Bar's packaging was defensible because the packaging existed precisely to defend it. Here is what the RX Bar brand DNA tells us about exactly what went wrong at David. Rahal did not abandon transparency accidentally. He replaced independent verification with human credibility, Atia's credentials, Huberman's reach, Schwarzenegger's endorsement. The Theranos parallel is not about fraud, it is about architecture. Revolutionary claims backed by famous names, scientific prestige, and a methodology that could not be independently verified. That architecture survives only until a stranger runs a test. Byron Sharp writes in How Brands Grow that past success is a credential, not a guarantee. Here is what the RX Bar halo created at David, a permission structure. Investors, doctors, and consumers extended extraordinary benefit of the doubt because Rahal had earned it once before. But a founder's reputation accelerates trust. It does not replace verification. The more credibility you inherit, the more catastrophically it collapses when the verification finally arrives. RX Bar succeeded because the label was the verification. David succeeded because Rahal's name replaced it. Those are not the same business. Here is the thing that makes this story almost Shakespearean. Peter Rahal is the man who put no BS on a protein bar and sold it for $600 million. He built RX Bar on the premise that food companies lie and his would not. Then, according to a 46-page federal complaint supported by an FDA-accredited laboratory, he built his second company on a nutrition label that allegedly understated its calories by 83%. The man who invented transparency in protein bars may have forgotten exactly why it worked. As of March 2026, David Protein sells bars in over 3,000 retail locations. The calorie mislabeling class action and the antitrust case are both in early litigation. Peter Atia is gone. Andrew Huberman remains listed as an investor. RX Bar launched its clean label competitor at Target. Quest, Bear Bells, and Cliff continue scaling without a pending federal lawsuit. The $725 million valuation sits untouched by public markets, increasingly examined by courts. The moral is not that EPG is fraudulent, a judge will decide that. The moral is simpler. When your entire brand equity rests on one number printed on a gold wrapper, that number has to be unimpeachably right. Not right according to your proprietary methodology, not almost right. Right in the way that survives a lab test by a stranger. Transparency is only a competitive advantage until it becomes a standard, and then it is just the minimum.